What happens when one of the most controversial figures in modern royalty comes face to face with Britain's most uncompromising interviewer? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle sits down with Kevin O'Sullivan for what was supposed to be a straightforward discussion about her latest ventures, only to ignite a firestorm that left viewers absolutely stunned. The tension was palpable from the moment she walked into the studio, but nobody could have predicted the explosive confrontation that would unfold, ultimately leading to one of the most dramatic exits in television history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of Kevin O'Sullivan's show promised to be compelling television, but what transpired went far beyond anyone's expectations. The atmosphere in the studio was electric as Meghan Markle, dressed in an elegant cream blazer and speaking with that familiar practiced confidence, settled into the guest chair across from O'Sullivan. The host, known for his sharp wit and no-nonsense approach, had clearly done his homework, with a stack of notes and what appeared to be printed articles spread across his desk. "Welcome to the show, Meghan," O'Sullivan began, his tone polite, but carrying an undertone that suggested this wouldn't be the softball interview many celebrities have come to expect. "I have to say, you've been quite busy since stepping back from royal duties. New projects, new partnerships, new narratives. Where shall we start?" Meghan's smile was picture-perfect, the kind that had been refined through years of public appearances and media training. "Thank you for having me, Kevin. I'm excited to talk about the meaningful work we're doing and the positive impact we're trying to make in the world." But O'Sullivan wasn't interested in talking points. He leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening. "Meaningful work. That's interesting phrasing, because I've been looking at some of your recent business ventures, and I have to ask about the timing. Your podcast deal, your Netflix series, your various partnerships with major corporations. These all seem to materialize quite quickly after your departure from royal life. Some might say conveniently quickly." The first crack in Meghan's composure appeared as a brief tightening around her eyes. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Kevin. Harry and I have always been committed to using our platform for good. These partnerships allow us to amplify important voices and create content that matters." "Using your platform for good," O'Sullivan repeated, his voice taking on a slightly mocking tone. "Your platform. Let's talk about that platform for a moment. Would you say that platform exists because of your acting career, or because you married into the British royal family?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Meghan's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, but her media training kicked in. "I think my work speaks for itself, Kevin. I've been an advocate for women's rights and social justice long before I met Harry. My humanitarian work, my involvement with various causes, that's been consistent throughout my life." O'Sullivan wasn't buying it. He reached for one of the papers on his desk, adjusting his glasses with theatrical precision. "Humanitarian work. Yes, I've been reading about that. Tell me, when you were filming Suits in Toronto, how many humanitarian trips did you take? How many speeches did you give at the UN? Because I'm looking at your schedule from those years, and it seems like your humanitarian awakening coincided remarkably with your relationship with Prince Harry." The accusation was clear, and Meghan's carefully constructed facade began to show more obvious signs of strain. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. "I think you're being deliberately reductive about my background and my commitment to these issues. I've always cared about making a difference." "Always cared," O'Sullivan pressed, his voice growing more aggressive. "Let me ask you this directly, Meghan. Do you think you would have gotten that UN Women's speech if you hadn't been dating a prince? Do you think Netflix would have given you and Harry that $100 million deal if you were just an actress from a cable television show?" The studio fell silent except for the quiet hum of cameras. Meghan's breathing had become more visible, her chest rising and falling with obvious effort to maintain control. "I think," she said slowly, each word carefully measured, "that you're trying to diminish my accomplishments and my genuine desire to make a positive impact. That's disappointing, but not surprising." O'Sullivan sensed blood in the water. "Disappointing, but not surprising. Are you saying you expected this kind of scrutiny? Because that's interesting, considering how you and Harry have spoken about the unfair treatment you've received from the British media. But here's what I find fascinating, Meghan. You've positioned yourself as a victim of media scrutiny, yet you've also made your personal life, your royal experience, your relationship with the royal family, the cornerstone of your brand. You can't have it both ways. My brand. Meghan's voice rose slightly, the first real crack in her composure. Kevin, I think you're mischaracterizing what Harry and I are trying to do. We're sharing our story because we believe it can help other people. We're being authentic about our experiences. Authentic, O'Sullivan repeated, and there was no mistaking the skepticism in his voice now. Let's talk about authenticity. You've spoken extensively about your mental health struggles, which I don't want to minimize. But you've also monetized those struggles. Your Oprah interview, your Netflix series, your podcast. At what point does sharing your truth become exploiting your trauma for profit? The question hit like a physical blow. Meghan's face flushed, and her voice when she responded carried the first note of genuine anger. I think that's an incredibly callous way to frame someone's decision to speak openly about their mental health. We shared our story because we thought it could help people who were going through similar experiences. And the timing. O'Sullivan shot back. The fact that this revelation about your mental health struggles came out just as you were launching your media career, that's just coincidence. I don't like what you're implying, Meghan said, her voice now carrying a warning edge. Are you suggesting that I fabricated my mental health struggles for publicity? O'Sullivan held up his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking questions. Questions that I think a lot of people have been thinking but haven't been brave enough to ask. You see, Meghan, you and Harry have built your entire post-royal brand on the narrative that you were mistreated, that you were victims. But every time someone asks you a difficult question, every time someone challenges that narrative, you retreat into victim mode. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Meghan's eyes had gone cold, her practiced smile completely abandoned. I think you're confusing accountability with attack, Kevin. I'm happy to discuss my work, my projects, my goals. But I won't sit here and be ambushed with baseless accusations designed to generate controversy. Ambushed? O'Sullivan's voice was incredulous. This is journalism, Meghan. This is what happens when you put yourself in the public eye and profit from your public profile. You don't get to control the narrative forever. You don't get to pick and choose which questions you answer. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and everyone in the studio could feel the shift from uncomfortable interview to something much more volatile. Meghan's hands were now clenched in her lap, and her voice when she spoke carried a tremor of barely controlled fury. I think we need to take a step back here, Kevin. I came on this show to discuss my work and my projects, not to be subjected to a character assassination based on your personal opinions about my motivations. But O'Sullivan wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by her discomfort. Character assassination? I'm asking you to explain the contradictions in your public statements. You can't claim to want privacy while simultaneously doing tell-all interviews. You can't claim to be a victim of media attention while building a media empire. These aren't personal attacks, Meghan. These are logical inconsistencies that deserve explanation. The battle lines were drawn, and it was clear that neither participant was willing to retreat. The tension in the studio was now so thick it was almost tangible, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary unfold. But what happened next would push this confrontation into territory that nobody could have anticipated. That O'Sullivan reached for another document from his pile, his movements deliberate and calculated. Since we're talking about logical inconsistencies, Meghan, let's discuss your relationship with the truth. You've made some pretty serious allegations about the royal family. Racism, lack of support, being cut off financially. But when pressed for specifics, for evidence, you seem to retreat into vague statements about conversations and concerns that can't be verified. Meghan's eyes flashed dangerously. Are you calling me a liar, Kevin? Because that's what it sounds like you're doing. I'm asking you to provide evidence for your claims. O'Sullivan replied coolly. You've accused one of the most respected institutions in the world of institutional racism. That's a serious allegation. Where's your proof? The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Meghan's composure, which had been cracking steadily throughout the interview, now showed deep fissures. Her voice when she responded was tight with controlled anger. I shared my truth about my experiences. I don't need to provide you with receipts. For my lived experience. Your truth, O'Sullivan repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. There's that phrase again. But here's the thing about truth, Meghan. It's not subjective. Either someone made racist comments about your unborn child, or they didn't. Either you were denied mental health support, or you weren't. Either you were cut off financially, or you weren't. You can't hide behind my truth when you're making accusations that damage real people's reputations. The studio crew exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was heading. But O'Sullivan seemed completely in his element, pressing his advantage like a skilled prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness. You know what I find most interesting, Meghan? You've positioned yourself as someone who speaks truth to power, but you've been remarkably selective about which truths you're willing to tell. You'll talk about alleged racism within the royal family, but you won't discuss why your own family members have been so vocal about their concerns regarding your behavior. Meghan's hands were now trembling slightly, her carefully maintained facade crumbling in real time. My family situation is complicated, and I'm not going to discuss private family matters on television. Private family matters, O'Sullivan pounced. But you'll discuss private royal family matters on international television. You'll talk about private conversations with the Prince of Wales, private concerns about your son's skin color, private discussions about mental health resources. But your own family, the people who raised you, who knew you before you became famous, they're off limits. The accusation hit its mark. Meghan's face flushed red, and her voice when she responded carried a note of desperation. That's completely different, Kevin, and you know it. The royal family are public figures. They have obligations to the public. So, do you? O'Sullivan shot back immediately. You've made yourself a public figure. You've profited from your public profile. You don't get to hide behind privacy when it's convenient for you while violating everyone else's privacy when it suits your narrative. The confrontation was reaching a boiling point. Meghan had begun to shift in her chair, her body language, screaming discomfort and barely contained rage. But O'Sullivan wasn't done. Let's talk about your podcast, Meghan. Archetypes. You spent 12 episodes talking about the stereotypes that hold women back, but you've built your entire career on playing into one of the oldest stereotypes in the book. The ambitious woman, who marries into wealth and power and then claims victimhood when people question her motives. How do you reconcile that contradiction? The question was devastating in its directness. Meghan's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. I think you're deliberately misrepresenting both my work and my experiences. That's not journalism, Kevin. That's character assassination. Character assassination, O'Sullivan repeated, his voice rising for the first time. You keep using that phrase. But let me ask you this, Meghan. What would you call what you did to the royal family? What would you call sitting down with Oprah Winfrey and making unsubstantiated allegations about racism and lack of support? What would you call releasing a Netflix series that portrayed them as cold, uncaring, and potentially racist? If what I'm doing is character assassination, what do you call what you've done to them? The studio fell silent except for the sound of Meghan's increasingly labored breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking with fury. I told my truth about my experiences. I never made any unsubstantiated allegations. Your truth. Again, O'Sullivan said, his voice now cold and clinical. But here's what I find fascinating about your truth, Meghan. It always seems to paint you as the victim and everyone else as the villain. Your family, the royal family, the British media, the British public. Everyone's wrong except you. Everyone's racist except you. Everyone's unreasonable except you. Do you see the pattern here? The attack was surgical and brutal. Meghan's face had gone pale, and her hands were now visibly shaking. I think you're being deliberately cruel, Kevin. I think you're trying to provoke me into losing my temper so you can have a viral moment. Viral moment, O'Sullivan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Everything's about the viral moment with you, isn't it? Everything's about the brand, the narrative, the image. But what about accountability? What about taking responsibility for the damage you've caused? Damage I've caused. Meghan's voice cracked, and for the first time, she looked genuinely wounded. Kevin, I shared my experiences because I thought it might help other people who were going through similar situations. I never intended to cause damage. Never intended, O'Sullivan pressed. But you had to know that accusing the royal family of racism would cause damage. You had to know that portraying them as uncaring and unsupportive would damage their reputations. You had to know that your Netflix series would be seen as a betrayal of the family that welcomed you. You can't claim ignorance about the consequences of your actions. The confrontation had reached a crescendo of intensity. Meghan was now leaning forward in her chair, her composure completely shattered, her voice rising to match O'Sullivan's aggressive tone. "You know what, Kevin? I think you're jealous. I think you're a small, bitter man who can't stand the fact that a woman of color, had the courage to speak truth to power. I think you're threatened by the fact that I didn't just sit quietly and accept mistreatment." The personal attack seemed to energize O'Sullivan rather than offend him. Jealous? Of what? Of someone who abandoned their family, married into another family, and then publicly betrayed them for profit? Of someone who claims to want privacy while courting publicity at every opportunity? Of someone who preaches about compassion while showing none to the people who raised her or the family that welcomed her? "You don't know anything about my family situation," Meghan snapped, her voice now openly hostile. "You don't know anything about what I went through as a member of the royal family. You're just another British tabloid journalist trying to tear down a successful woman." "Successful woman," O'Sullivan repeated mockingly. "Is that what you call someone who profits from family dysfunction? Someone who monetizes personal trauma? Someone who builds a brand on victimhood?" The studio had become a battleground, with both participants now engaged in open warfare. The professional veneer had been completely stripped away, revealing the raw antagonism beneath. But what happened next would take this confrontation to a level that would shock everyone present and create a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. O'Sullivan leaned back in his chair, a cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know what, Meghan? I think we've finally gotten to the real you. Not the polished, media-trained duchess, not the humanitarian activist, but the real person underneath. And what I see is someone who can't handle being challenged, someone who immediately plays the victim card when faced with difficult questions." Meghan's eyes blazed with fury. "You want to see the real me, Kevin? Fine. The real me is someone who won't be bullied by a has-been journalist desperate for relevance. The real me is someone who has achieved more in my life than you ever will in yours." The personal attack seemed to strike a nerve. O'Sullivan's composure cracked slightly, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Achieved more? By what metric? By marrying well? By monetizing family drama? By building a brand on victimhood? Those aren't achievements, Meghan. Those are opportunistic career moves." "You're pathetic," Meghan shot back, her voice now loud enough that the studio crew looked genuinely alarmed. "You're a bitter, irrelevant man who can't stand the fact that I've built something meaningful with my life while you're stuck hosting a failing talk show, desperately trying to create controversy because you have nothing else to offer." The insult about his show hit home. O'Sullivan's face darkened, and when he spoke, his voice carried a venom that hadn't been there before. "Failing talk show? At least I built my career on actual work, not on sleeping my way into relevance. At least I don't have to monetize family trauma to pay my bills." The studio gasped audibly at the crude implication. Meghan's face went white, then red, her entire body trembling with rage. "How dare you?" she whispered, then louder. "How dare you? How dare I what?" O'Sullivan pressed, sensing he'd found her breaking point. "How dare I point out that your entire career is built on who you married? How dare I suggest that maybe, just maybe, you're not the victim you pretend to be? You're disgusting," Meghan spat, her voice shaking with emotion. "You're a disgusting, misogynistic pig who can't stand the fact that a woman had the courage to speak out against injustice." "Injustice?" O'Sullivan laughed harshly. "You call being welcomed into one of the most prestigious families in the world injustice? You call being given a platform, a title, and unlimited resources injustice? You call having your wedding watched by billions of people injustice? The only injustice here is what you've done to the people who try to help you." The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. Both participants were now standing, their chairs pushed back, facing each other like gladiators in an arena. The studio crew was frozen, unsure whether to intervene or continue filming this extraordinary meltdown. "You know what your problem is, Kevin." Meghan's voice was now a controlled shriek. "You can't stand that I didn't just sit quietly and accept mistreatment. You can't stand that I had the courage to speak my truth and walk away from a toxic situation. You represent everything that's wrong with the British media, everything that's wrong with this country's treatment of women, especially women of color." "There it is," O'Sullivan said triumphantly. "The race card. When all else fails, when you can't defend your actions, When you can't explain your contradictions, you play the race card. It's pathetic, Meghan. It's beneath you, and it's insulting. To people who actually face real racism, the accusation was the final straw. Meghan's control snapped completely. Real racism? You don't think I faced real racism? You don't think being the target of years of hateful coverage, being subjected to different standards than other royal family members, being attacked for everything from how I held my bump to how I closed a car door, you don't think that was real racism? I think it was criticism, O'Sullivan replied coldly. I think it was accountability. I think it was journalism. And I think you can't tell the difference because you've never faced real consequences for your actions in your life. Never faced. Consequences? Meghan's voice cracked with emotion. I gave up everything for that family. I gave up my career, my independence, my identity. I tried to serve. I tried to contribute. And I was met with jealousy, hostility, and yes, racism. And when I couldn't take it anymore, when it was affecting my mental health, when I was having suicidal thoughts, I made the difficult decision to prioritize my well-being and my family's well-being. And then you monetized it, O'Sullivan said, quietly, his voice cutting through her emotional outburst like a knife. You took that pain, that trauma, and you turned it into a business opportunity. You packaged it, sold it, and profited from it. That's not healing, Meghan. That's exploitation. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Meghan stared at him, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly, tears of rage streaming down her face. When she finally found her voice, it was barely a whisper. You're a monster, she said. You're an absolute monster. I'm a journalist, O'Sullivan replied simply. I ask difficult questions. I challenge public figures. I hold people accountable. If that makes me a monster in your eyes, then I'll wear that badge with pride. Meghan looked around the studio wildly, as if suddenly realizing where she was, what she was doing, how far. She'd fallen from the composed, dignified image she'd tried to project. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of her breakdown, every crack in her facade. This is exactly what you wanted, isn't it? She said, her voice now hollow with defeat. You wanted me to lose my temper. You wanted me to look unstable, unreasonable, hysterical. You wanted to prove that I'm everything you think I am. I wanted the truth, O'Sullivan said, his voice gentler now, but no less firm. And I think we finally got it. The truth is that you can't handle criticism. The truth is that you can't take responsibility for your actions. The truth is that when challenged, you retreat into victimhood and personal attacks. Meghan straightened her shoulders, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. For a moment, she looked like she might try to salvage the situation to regain some dignity. But then her face hardened, and she reached for the microphone, clipped to her blazer. I don't have to sit here and listen to this, she said, her voice steadier now, but still trembling with suppressed emotion. I don't have to subject myself to this kind of treatment. She yanked the microphone off with such force that the wire caught on her jacket, nearly tearing the fabric. She threw it onto the floor between them, the sound of it hitting the ground amplified through the studio speakers. This isn't journalism, Kevin. This is harassment. This is exactly the kind of behavior that drove me out of this country in the first place. The fact that you can sit there and call this accountability while you're clearly trying to destroy me personally shows exactly what kind of person you are. O'Sullivan watched her calmly, making no move to stop her as she gathered her purse and stood to leave. Running away again, Meghan? Just like you ran away from your family. Just like you ran away from your royal duties. Just like you run away from every difficult situation in your life. She froze at the studio door, her hand on the handle. For a moment, it looked like she might turn around, might try to have the last word. But then she seemed to deflate, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion and defeat. I feel sorry for you, Kevin, she said without turning around. I feel sorry for anyone who thinks this is what success looks like. I feel sorry for a man who has to tear down others to feel important. And with that, she yanked open the studio door and stormed out, leaving O'Sullivan alone at his desk, surrounded by the stunned silence of his crew and the scattered papers of his research. The cameras continued to roll, capturing the empty chair where she'd been sitting, the discarded microphone on the floor, and O'Sullivan's satisfied smile as he straightened his tie and looked directly into the camera. Well, he said, his voice perfectly composed. I think that tells you everything you need to know about Meghan Markle. Thank you for watching. and we'll see you next time. The interview was over, but the fallout was just beginning. In those final explosive minutes, television history had been made, and viewers around the world had witnessed the complete unraveling of one of the most carefully constructed public personas of the modern era.